Welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast, where it is our mission to explore the business and future of video games. We bring together the industry's brightest builders, investors, and thinkers to keep a pulse on current events, dissect emerging trends in games, share lessons learned, and have a great time. This podcast is also part of Naavik's growing ecosystem, which ranges from free and premium research to consulting and advisory services. For more information, visit www.naavik.co. This episode is sponsored by our partners at CleverTap Gaming. CleverTap Gaming is the all-in-one platform that enables game studios and publishers to create personalized player experiences. It's the only solution that provides a real-time understanding of player actions and integrates lifecycle marketing, live ops, and remote configuration into a holistic experience. In other words, you can maximize engagement, retention, and monetization through real-time segmentation and targeted offers. And you can run live ops campaigns with A/B testing, push notifications, in-app messaging, and much more. To discover how CleverTap Gaming can best serve your games team, simply visit clevertap.com/gaming or check out the details in the show notes. And with that, let's jump into the episode. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Bush, and I've been excited about this episode for quite some time because the topic of today's discussion is on seemingly everyone's mind these days, artificial intelligence. Now, clearly, AI, machine learning, it's all a loaded term that has been all the rage in recent months. Companies like OpenAI with ChatGPT opened the floodgates. NVIDIA is now the latest trillion-dollar company due to soaring demand for its GPUs. And now discussions about what is newly possible are permeating countless industries. That also includes gaming, where teams everywhere are trying to figure out how to apply this new wave of tech to their games, their processes, and more. But as with every hype cycle, there's a lot of noise. So it's important to take a step back, ask what's real versus hype, and try to get a sense of where this is all really going. It's a conversation that's bigger than one episode, so we'll be digging into this for quite some time, but I'm excited to help kickstart that conversation today with two amazing guests. Ilya Gelfenbeyn, co-founder and CEO of Inworld AI, and George Ng, co-founder and CTO of GGWP. They're both here to help us make sense of everything going on and share more about what their businesses are up to. Guys, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, for having me.
Awesome. Well, it's going to be a lot of fun. And before we really dive in, I just want to give you both a chance to properly introduce yourselves. We'll get to your companies in a second as follow-up questions, but could you both just quickly run through your backgrounds and what led you to the games industry? Ilya, I'll kick it over to you to start on this one.
I'm pretty new to games industry. So, I started to look into it like when we started the company a couple of years ago. So prior to this, I was at Google for 4 years. And before I built a company that was called API.ai, and before Speak to It, which was a consumer voice assistant initially. And then we pivoted into a conversational developer platform that was acquired by Google in 2016. So most of my background is in actually building developer tools and working on AI and specifically natural language.
Awesome. And just a quick follow-up to that. We had Kylan, your co-founder, on the pod in March, and he did a great job explaining Inworld AI's mission and helped us think through the possibilities of AI NPCs. But for those who missed that episode, could you just quickly share what Inworld AI does? And maybe also just if there's anything new over the past 6 months of note.
Yeah, absolutely. So Inworld is a platform for building AI NPCs or AI-driven NPCs. So effectively, we are there are two parts of the product. So one is the engine, the runtime that accepts as an input whatever the character is observing in their world, like who they are, where they are, who's nearby, what they are saying, what they are doing, any events that are happening, any information about the environment, and as an output returns the behavior of the character. Right, so speech, movements, gestures, actions, memory changes, goal setting, and so on. So, an easy way of thinking about it is we are adding brains to NPCs, and providing control flow for them. The second part of the product is the creator studio. So this is where creators, game designers, writers, like other creators, are building characters by like describing what they want to see. And it's very similar to writing a role description for a human actor. So you give them a background, information about the world they live in, emotional profile, style of speech, maybe some like insecurities and flaws, narrative control, like what kind of goals they have to accomplish, and so on. And so, like after you do it, we pack this like model configuration and then run it with Unity, Unreal SDKs, connecting to any proprietary engines. But yeah, that's what we are.
Awesome. And yeah, it's really exciting. I enjoyed the episode where Kylan came on. And so if you're a listener and you're not familiar and you want to learn more about Inworld AI, we'll obviously talk more about it today. But if you want to even get more insight into the nuts and bolts of what they're really building and how it works for developers, I recommend, you can scroll back in the podcast feed, or you could just Google Kylan Gibbs, Navid Gaming Podcast, and it'll come right up. But George, let's take this over to you. Similarly, I'll ask about GGWP in a second, but first, could you hit on your journey to the games industry first?
Yeah, so I'm a lifelong gamer, even though I'm not particularly good at games. My primary field in graduate school is actually game theory. So I've always been interested in strategy of things. Again, not directly related to video games there. I've taught things like ML, statistics, behavioral economics, so things around AI for some time. Prior work, I was a research scientist at DARPA. I was a chief data scientist at Cray. So as we discussed some of the ways we use AI, some of those experiences may come up. My prior startup was also in an applied AI area. Specifically, the company was called Science, where we built cyber risk models to help evaluate security risk.
Great. And you're both also serial entrepreneurs. And we'll hit on that later in the episode too, because I'm just curious what you have learned across your journeys. But we'll save that more towards the end. But George, let's hit on GGWP. For those who don't know, what is it? What are you working on? But also, it seems like the company maybe it always has, but it's kind of taken on even more of like an AI focus or branding recently. So we'd just kind of love to know how all of that intersects in your mission.
Absolutely. I assume given the listener base, most people will know what GGWP stands for. In case you don't, it's good game, well played. It's a common term to show sportsmanship at the end of a gaming session. The goal is to help games modernize their support and community functions to allow them to create a more engaging and respectful gaming environment. So how do we actually do that? Our company is always focused on AI based moderation to help streamline the detection and evaluation process of player behavior.
Awesome. And one thing that, I think is noteworthy, or at least, I like to think about or point out with GGWP is that, especially like in an era where there's a bunch of fear mongering about AI and, its impact in, taking over the world or being, a force for bad in some ways that we have to fight against. GGWP at its core, even though you don't really, frame it this way, it's all about using the technology for safety reasons and moderation in games. And so, I don't know. I feel like there should maybe even be more discussion about AI for good in games. I don't know if you think similarly about that, George.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not just looking at negative events, right? We're also looking for positive detections, deliberately looking for collaborative gameplay where possible. And we definitely see that more coming from game designers. And then, of course, it manifests itself in chat, voice, and in the gameplay actions itself.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and dive a bit deeper here. And here's one question that I want to start with. And I'm really curious to hear your guys' takes on this. Is AI in games a sustaining innovation, meaning it provides incremental improvements to what games already are and how we already work today? Or is it a disruptive innovation, meaning it could fundamentally change what games are and how they're made and run? Maybe it's a false dichotomy, and you can kind of share your nuanced thinking on that. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I'll hand it over if either of you wants to kick that off.
Yeah, I can start. So I think it's really both. The reason for that is that, there are different types of AI in gaming. So some obvious things, start with, for example, producing assets more efficiently, faster, or like pre-producing assets, right? So like imagery and things like this. This is basically just augments like what creators are doing now, and companies may decide like, well, what is the pace of like adopting this technology should be internally, right? So that's like pretty like organic growth. On the other side, there are things like AI NPCs that where companies do have to kind of make this leap of faith in a way in order to properly integrate. Again, we are working on making it much more organic to them. Helping them first to build characters probably in design time and like just steal some lines of like the interactions that characters are creating into their pre-scripted engines. But overall, I think it's really a matter of some successful reference use cases to be launched that like the whole industry basically will change the standard, like the kind of like anticipated quality of the games. And in this sense, like that could be like a huge change to the industry.
Yeah, so I'll get your thoughts in a second, George, but let me double click on that from the Inworld AI perspective for a moment. Do you view AI NPCs as more just augmenting and improving the NPCs that we all know today across games and genres, or do you view what you're building more as like a mechanism for building something entirely new that creates new types of games, entirely new types of player experiences? Maybe the answer is both, and it's a journey. But curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think there are like really just two steps. So first step is take existing NPCs and just make them better, right? And by better, I mean not just making them like more talkative, right? But like more kind of like adaptable to the player's behavior and preferred like style of playing, things like this, right? Because when we are talking to many studios, like, well, some people would say, I do not like, I kind of like current NPCs because I can like scroll through the dialogue and continue to my quest, right? And I do not want to just talk to a chatbot there, and that's not the goal. So like, if you are a player who like really like is not interested in this story and like wants to proceed, like a smart NPC would just say, go there. That's it, right? Like if you are like more interested in like learning about the story, or like you want some additional hints or something like this, it will really be up to you how this like narrative kind of like opens to you. And so yeah, so and that's the first step, really, just improving current interactions with NPCs. My favorite part is the second step. So I do play a lot of games, and I play like a lot of new games. Well, first of all, to just be aware of like what's happening like in the industry, right? But like generally speaking, it's really hard for me to find games that I really enjoy, just because majority of them have like too many cutscenes, too many like scripted elements. So you really do not have like a lot of freedom there. And like I think my ideal games that I really expect to appear is like where you are dropped to a location and you basically from there you just learn your way. Like, well, you're trying to understand what's happening here, like what you are supposed to do, and in general, like, well, making this. So you can compare it to what happened to gaming with like introduction of open worlds, right? So like a lot of people started to explore worlds, and like and for many of them it actually became the main motivation to play these games, right? But like if you compare it to real life, open worlds are not really realistic, just because in real life it's not only the location, it's actually the interaction, like social interactions that are happening in this world, that's important. And I believe with AI driven NPCs we kind of solve this, right? So we add this like new dimension to open worlds, making games much more immersive, much more realistic, and like much more engaging.
Yeah, that's exciting. I've always in some way viewed Ultima Online from many years ago as like an important step function change in you know kind of the freedoms that it allows players, because then
Yep.
like that was probably the game where game developers realized like, oh, like if you kind of create a world in which players have some freedom, they will take the game in places that you didn't expect. And that's actually a feature, not a bug, and it's really exciting. And that was kind of like a pivotal change for the next many, many years of MMORPGs. And I could see a similar case being made, even though personally I have no idea, what exactly is going to be made when you throw in more AI NPCs and just kind of creating like a new layer of freedom and interactivity that just widens the creative surface area, and can kind of help define where some of these worlds go next. So that's really exciting. George, I want to get your take on this general question too of sustaining innovation versus disruptive one. You obviously focus in a different corner of the market, so I'd be curious to hear your take broadly on that question, but even more specifically with what you're working on at GGWP.
Yeah, I think the framework is suitable. I think we should note first that the gaming dev market has a handful of really large publishers, and disproportionately for them, a lot of innovation will be more sustaining. And there's millions of small devs, including a lot of individuals with part-time jobs that are just developing a game on the side. And for them, a vast majority of these things will be disruptive innovation. Speaking more specifically about moderation, I think for moderation, for large devs, they will have a lot of these systems already. Some use AI and some do not. So you're talking about incremental improvements to that AI. For moderation, this means enhancing existing models or workflows and sanctioning rules. Those same things, again, would actually be disruptive innovation for a small market. Again, they don't have dedicated community resources, let alone full-fledged workflow functionality or AI to detect these models. There's still relevant disruptive innovation for large devs too. Here you're talking about more new models using extended context. So at GGWP, we're often looking across different source modes, meaning looking at things like gameplay combined with chat, or voice combined with gameplay or player reports, or looking at longer extended history, which is relevant. So I think there's disruptive innovation there. I think another area of disruptive innovation is around cost effectiveness. Essentially, what we're doing is really lowering the costs by using the AI to automate and triage a lot of the sanctioning. So we're improving the number and the quality of incidents reviewed by the moderation and support teams.
That's really, really interesting. So I kind of want to switch gears and kind of talk about like where this is going in a bit more detail. So right now, NVIDIA, as I noted in the intro, is the market's biggest AI winner of sorts, because companies everywhere, data centers everywhere, they're clamoring for the H100 GPUs. They can't get made fast enough. And NVIDIA is taking, outsized profits on every single one of those that's getting made. But as teams get better access to these chips and ramp up usage in the coming months and years, I don't think it's crazy to expect that, where value flows next, it'll accelerate more towards services that actually use that compute power for new things. And so I'm curious, just in terms of like kind of where you look at the games industry, or even just more broadly, like what do you think like is like the next like sub wave of this major wave to hit? Like, is that generally right in saying that kind of the services, certain services here and there will be the next big winner, or are there other shoes to drop that you are excited about and looking forward to? Ilya, I'll start with you.
Yeah. So my take here is, well, obviously it's great to sell like picks and shovels during the gold rush. So NVIDIA is really in a good position here. But there are like multiple layers of this like picks and shovels, right? So like at the end of the day, yeah, these are like consumer services, like consumer facing services that will benefit from like improved performance, like some new features and so on. But like, in between you have like multiple layers of this tool providers, platforms that will benefit from this. I think like big trend that's happening now. Like obviously there was like a hype cycle, and like it's happening still. But in the last couple of years, or maybe a year even, the focus was mainly on some kind of research findings. So companies were talking about some really shiny, interesting demos, examples of what's possible with all these new models, right? So now what we see is that large companies are major clients of these technologies are really trying to apply those to their businesses. Gaming is one of these verticals, but there are many others. And they are starting to face a lot of challenges that are very specific to really using them in production, right? So starting from basic things like privacy, security, scaling, other things, to more kind of verticalized needs, what the specific verticals need, outside of just ChatGPT generating something quickly, right? So you can kind of get very fast to 80% of what is desired, but then if you want to get closer to 95, that's a lot of work, right? And I think from this perspective, where we are now is really trying to apply all this great research that has happened and is still happening to vertical use cases and make those work, right? And I think there will be a bunch of winners, there will be a lot of losers as well, as in any gold rush. But yeah, that's very exciting.
George, anything you want to add to that?
Sure. So the H100s are 30x faster in inference speed. So it means that you'll be able to have more complex models and faster training, sometimes both. So what we're really talking about is what gets additionally unlocked versus what becomes marginally better. So things like, obviously Ilya has a high functioning company today, so we already have smart NPCs. But does this unlock a deeper level? Does the added context link now from these additional models create an even deeper, more valuable experience? Things like dynamic bots, for example, are things that games are looking at that I'd imagine that could benefit greatly. In moderation, some of the big challenges have been voice in real time. It's just been cost prohibitive. And obviously, having this additional inference power matters a lot. Another area is just getting into really granular telemetry. If you think about the types of data a game could log, you could log 240 frames per second of telemetry information and actions. Obviously, you don't do that typically, but if you want to start looking at things in real time, theoretically, it becomes much more feasible because of the cost reduction. There are some marginal improvements as well, every model will run better. They aforementioned context-rich models, some of them become unlocked. So if you're looking at things like grooming or looking at combination of attributes, you'll better be able to do that. Ilya brought up the ethical focus point. I think it's indirect. It's just that if you're able to solve some of these compute issues, researchers and engineers and product managers are more able to focus and tackle the more nuanced cases around fairness and transparency. So the hardware indirectly helps with that as well. But ultimately, it's clear that the cost will be reduced. So if our costs are reduced, we can in turn pass it along to our end customers. And in turn, that would make things like AI-based moderation more accessible for everyone.
Exciting. You guys are hyping me up. You guys are also, living and breathing the cutting edge. And I guess, and as you're talking about, clearly lean on the optimistic side of what is possible here. But, as people who are deeply immersed in the actual technology and have, an above average sense of what's realistically possible, are there any corners of this games X AI wave where expectations are ahead of themselves and you think people should calm down a little bit?
I'm pretty optimistic in general, right? And as looking at the pace of new technologies developing, I kind of agree to believe that pretty much everything is possible. That said, again, bringing it to actual games, to actual products takes more time than it seems like it would take, right? Because you can very quickly build some quick and dirty experiments and and see great results that are 80% there. But like bringing them and like launching them in real products will take time. So from this perspective, like from the kind of like dreaming perspective, yeah, like pretty much anything is possible, I would say at this point. It just will take some time.
Aaron, I think I have a few,
Gotcha.
but I mean, we're repeat entrepreneurs, so we're probably biased towards being optimistic in these areas. For moderation, even, we're not going to reach fully automated moderation. I don't think it's advisable, especially for potential safety issues and ambiguous high severity events. These should undergo human review. We must be or continue to be vigilant about things like model biases. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't use the AI, but just ensure that we understand the biases and that we have proper human oversight in them. Content generation. I think for most internal teams using it, it's fine, right? Assuming it undergoes some human review. This kind of applies generally to every space. But for user-generated content, I think it gets a little bit trickier. I think I could plug GGWP and say moderation tools should apply in that area as well. But I think the bigger challenge there is that the game designers, once they allow the user-generated content for better engagement, they also have to have more, like the bar becomes higher to have clear game design goals and community guidelines for that system. Player-specific experiences is another area. AI-powered NPCs obviously can offer more engaging and dynamic experiences, but again, similar boundaries. I'll take another company that has had some, mixed reviews lately, like in Replica. Obviously, not the same as an NPC in games, but you can see how there's some overlap, and some could view that as a game. And we have to be careful about avoiding bad individual experiences for sensitive populations, and learn bad experiences based on group learning. And then I think the most dangerous area is probably just around monetization. There's already a lot of AI optimized actions based on player behavior. Obviously, quantitatively, this could improve, but it could negatively impact game enjoyment. So there probably need to be better guidelines on how to avoid predatory consumer behavior, especially given some consumers' perception of the gaming industry's reputation around things like loot, gacha, gambling type mechanics, or engagement there.
Those are both good answers, and so I guess I'll try my best to kind of double underline a couple of key things you said. One, George, you made me feel happy, and realizing that humans still have an important role to play in all of this. We're not handing over the keys to just code or robots anytime soon. There's always going to be a role for a human touch to make sure our priorities are straight, and that we are looking out for what's best for people, and always having a creative spirit. And Ilya, what you were saying, it seemed more that like, yeah, you're an optimist. You don't necessarily think there is too much of a limit on what is possible in time, but the time part was important. And I guess if you look at a hype cycle, maybe if we're nearing a kind of like a peak of inflated expectations, that doesn't necessarily mean what people are expecting won't happen, but maybe the expectations in terms of the timing are a little out of whack, and it'll just take more time to build what is possible before people will get it in their hands, and so could go through a bit of a hype cycle. And that does that sum up some of what you're saying? Okay.
Yeah. I just want to clarify, right? So, like, my answer is more kind of like in the perspective of end users, consumers, right? So basically, as a gamer, like you can imagine like lots of different interesting things, and they will be possible with AI. Like I kind of like the internal, the developer focus is somewhat different. And like I agree with George, there are like a lot of interesting challenges there. If the expectation is that new games will just appear with one press of a button, and they will be like high quality and wouldn't require any like human involvement. Yeah, that's not the case, and that's good, because we really want people to be part of the creative process.
Yeah. One other piece of this that I want to get into is the kind of the debate or ideas of open source versus closed source models right now, specifically as it comes to even just the games industry. So AI obviously is famously closed source, and we're now seeing more competitive open models like Meta's Llama 2 emerge. So Ilya, maybe you can start on this one, but why does this open versus closed source conversation matter in general and in games for those who are less familiar with the technicalities? And as related to that, I would just love to hear more details about the open source, work that you at Inworld AI are building.
Yeah. So why it is important? Well, for many reasons. So there are like more kind of like non-development reasons, but like, well, that have to do more about like observability. Like, well, people want to be able to see what's happening within the technology, right? Like how it works, what kind of data it is trained on, things like this. Second part is like more about kind of like stability and reliability. So basically, like if AI becomes a big part of your product, you probably want to be able to have some control over it, and like not just rely on some startup that like will may disappear at some point or something like this. And this is where like some considerations about open source are important. Also, like generally speaking, right, there is like this great debate around like, well, community supported open source products that may develop somewhat faster, but also have some challenges. So yeah, like there are like a lot of considerations there on like, well, what like how to focus on it. From the like process perspective or just like organizational perspective, building open source versus closed source software is very different, just like in terms of like how you manage your developers community, for example, right? So like if you're open source, you have to like share the roadmaps, discuss everything with the community, decide like what goes into like the main branches and whatnot, and so on, right? So that's a whole process. And like if you make this decision to like go like fully open source, for example, then like you have to change a lot of processes just and how you look at relationships with developers and like broader community. And specifically talking about AI, there are like a lot of considerations around data, right? Like the data that is like how to share this data, like well, what data is being used for training. Can you actually share it with developers, and like what are the licensing terms, and like many other things. For Inworld, we are kind of like trying to balance between closed and open source. So and like this is like an ongoing discussion, really. So like, well, we are still figuring out like what is the optimal configuration here. So, but generally speaking, right now, what we decided on is like, well, we are open sourcing some parts that are not core to us, that have to do like more with like voice related things, like some other things. So basically that are like aside of the main like brain that we are powering. So that's one part. Another part, like when we are working with selected partners, we can also make these solutions open source, but it's limited open source, right? So basically, like a large studio that works with us may have access to the source code, to feel like more secure in a way, and to be able to get more control. We like open sourcing the core part is challenging, mainly because it really just changes the way we have to work with the developer community, and so we are not doing it at this point.
Gotcha. That makes sense, and I'm curious to see how you all will evolve over time in your approach to working with the developer community as this area matures, and I'm sure you even continue to expand your ambitions. Another part of this conversation is less the technology, and I know you guys are technologists and builders at heart, but I also want to talk about business models for a moment, because I think that plays an important role in how this technology gets enabled and adopted by companies and consumers everywhere. And I kind of want to hit on both sides of that quickly, especially as it relates to games, because I think this is something that probably not many people have thought through so far. And also probably relates to kind of the whole sustaining versus disruptive innovation conversation from earlier, and how these capabilities actually get out there. And so, George, I'll start with you on this one, and maybe you can speak to like the enterprise side of this. Do you think that B2B business models in games could change as a result of more AI driven and AI powered technologies? Curious about your take generally, and again, even specifically with GGWP, which I know has been, tweaking its business model too.
Yeah. I'll actually try to tie this to openness too, because I think that's
Okay,
core. So if you think about the gaming market, again, looking at large devs versus smaller devs, large devs are in general going to be willing to help smaller ones unless it compromises their competitive advantage in some way, right? So we're operating in the moderation subspace specifically. And the reality is that games don't consider this to be part of their core IP or product differentiation. So using something like data sharing, again, not quite open source, but just sharing across, data sharing programs sort of illustrate some of these incentive differences. So if you think about if we created an industry consortium, which we've been trying to do, small devs would gain a lot of information for the amount of data they contribute, right? If you had everybody contribute, they have a much smaller ownership stake. And the opposite is true for large devs. So the incentives there are already misaligned in some way. And I think that influences both how they would view open source and closed source and how we would view it selling to these parties as well, right? In general, obviously, open source has value. It fosters collaboration, innovation. But because large publishers don't see it as a differentiator, it makes them theoretically willing to open source moderation philosophy. Now, the challenge is if you're a small game dev, like teachings or playbooks don't create a closed solution for you. You want the actual action plan or you want the data. And the large dev will not share that. Right. So that's certainly a struggle. I don't think having better AI tools or better AI hardware will necessarily change that. As far as how this influences our business model, we recently talked about our pay-as-you-go, no commit tier. And this was very deliberately introduced so that we can make our product more accessible, in part to target some of the earlier games or these smaller game devs. For the most part, a majority of our customers today are larger customers where we sign committed contracts for. While this isn't ideal at times, potentially for scalability or openness, it does allow us to create more secure solutions and more bespoke solutions at times when needed, which does allow us to have a more sticky solution with the customer and have better retention as well.
Gotcha. That all makes sense. And I was also starting to sense a little bit of your game theory thinking, leaking out as some of your logic in that answer. Ilya, obviously, your company sells B2B as well. So if you have comments on that, I'd be curious to hear it. But I'm also curious to hear your take on the consumer side of this too, because on your website, there's a stat that says 81% of gamers would be willing to pay more for games with AI NPCs. And I'm just curious what you think that means in practice. And to those who are skeptical about AI NPCs really unlocking new transaction options or providing pricing power to studios, what would you change to add nuance to that conversation or help change their minds?
Yeah, I think I would start looking at this from the value perspective, what kind of value these technologies bring to both developers and end users, right? So specifically, when we are talking about AI NPCs, well, we are talking generally about a few things. So one is improvements in engagement, retention, playtime, and two, like if we are talking about more like disruptive innovations, right? So like basically introducing new styles of gameplay that like may become market standard and basically will be like unavoidable. So basically, like for an end user, like if you are given a choice to play a game with dumb NPCs or smart NPCs, you would probably select smart NPCs like every time. So from this perspective, like I would focus on like say like improvement in the engagement, right? So like if engagement is improved, you can get the game from like just a good game to an endless game. So where basically players return like again and again because they have like relationships with the characters. It always makes sense to just log in and do something new there, right? And so if you just look at like generally how games work, right? Like when like there is like some peak like at launch, and then like it's like fading out like slowly with like kind of like new like many players already played this game, and like there is some motivation for them to return, but like generally like there are like there is some kind of like churn, and so if we are able to improve this, right, so that's a like a no-brainer for studios to implement. And so there are a couple of approaches here again. So one is like for studio, if they see that engagement is increased, revenue is increased, it's pretty easy to justify the cost then, right? So I mean, like, it has to be like net positive for them, but like, it can actually just improve the economy and like, economics of the game, and they can like either like make it a little bit more expensive or introduce some like in-game purchases or something like this, right, to support this. Another way is to try to actually pass it to the end users. So like end users may decide whether they want or not to use like to work with this like smart NPCs, like especially in the cases where it's like it's your companion in the game, for example, right, that you may or may not have, and like you really decide on that. And like as we see, like players are extremely positive about it, and so generally speaking, both models really work. Like, and then it's really a question of how to how exactly to implement it. And like, here we can be pretty flexible. So it could be just like usage based, like pay as you go. It could be more like revenue sharing. And like if we are thinking about like passing it to the end users, it actually becomes a monetization opportunity for studios, which is like very important, especially these days, where when like a lot of studios are deciding like to monetize more on existing IP as opposed to building some new IP, right? And so if we come to them and tell, you can, there is like this like great feature that people are willing to pay for, that's also like a no-brainer for them, and like and we can share revenues with them. And again, like in this case, they will not be thinking, like, if it's like usage model, like how much will I spend? Like, will I go bankrupt if like, my users are like too talkative? They will actually be interested in like making these characters like as engaging as possible to bring players to their experience and not competitors, and get like more interactions and get more revenue share.
Interesting. Appreciate the thoughtful answer there, and I really look forward to seeing how that plays out in the wild over the next many months and years. It'll be really exciting to see. I do want to switch gears and kind of talk about other aspects of being a founder, both with your current companies, but also just experiences over time at previous companies as well. And maybe a first pit stop on this part of the conversation is to just talk about fundraising. Both of your companies have recently raised meaningful venture money, and Ilya, I think Inworld is now technically the most funded AI gaming company. And on one hand, some of the market hype here, just broadly, is giving kind of strong 2021 vibes, which then mean reverted down. But on the other hand, as we're talking about today, like much of the progress here is both very real and very exciting. And so As founders in an environment like this, I'm curious how you navigated this environment and ecosystem with those factors at play. Like, how did you think through like how much and at what valuations to raise at, given the opportunities at hand and kind of the market's hype of late? George, I'll kick this over to you first.
Sure. Given the volatility of current market conditions, we aim to raise a substantial amount as a safety net just for scaling uncertainties that we could encounter. As repeat founders, we sought a fair valuation that would also honor our long-term relationships with investors. In terms of who to raise from or who to work with specifically, from my experience, especially with my last startup, the specific VC partner was much more valuable than the firm itself. So especially around introductions and relationships in a target space, since we're B2B SaaS. So we prioritize bringing on advisors and investors who we felt would be additive or genuinely additive, who could be potential strategic partners in the gaming space specifically. As far as the top end of our valuation, I think we probably could have woven a broader story that branched out of gaming if we really wanted to. And we sort of deliberately didn't describe such an expansive narrative into general AI applications, like say, general player, general consumer analysis, that you could potentially take some of the same information that we are to eventually do. Now, we may choose to do that at some point, but I felt like it detracted from our core mission at this point. We really believe that we need to first earn that right to diversify by first succeeding in our primary domain. And given that for me and my two other co-founders, this was really a mission-oriented problem.
Gotcha. Ilya, how about you? How did you think about all the variables of fundraising and setting your company up for success from that lens?
I think a really important consideration here is that we are building a completely new market, right? So, it doesn't exist at this point. What is good about it is if you talk to like all these game studios and some other clients outside of gaming, they all agree that's the future, right? So like they do not see a future without it. So it's really a matter of kind of like implementation and time, right? Which are like pretty important unknowns. Well, for the implementation, I'm like pretty confident we've done it before. For time, it doesn't depend on us, like at least partially, right? So it depends on the market, on many other things, including some like legal considerations, including just adoption, some first adoption, and so on. So from this perspective, we've been thinking about being ready to to different scenarios and creating this safety net. So whatever time it requires to become the mainstream, we should be ready for that, right? But as we believe it is happening anyway, right? So that's as a so important platform shift in gaming and some other areas that it's not that difficult to convince investors in this. And actually, 3 of our previous rounds were all preempted. So basically, investors reached out to us usually, they tell us what we are working. So they are doing our pitch better than us oftentimes, right? So so a partner at a VC firm reaches out and says how great this market is and and what are all these opportunities and so on, which is really great to see. And so for us it was very different from first startup experience. So this time we were able to really select which investors to work with. And to George's point, the personalities are extremely important. We were in our previous round, we were lucky to get back our previous board director, Moritz, who was at Bitcraft and now is at Lightspeed. He's awesome. So it was kind of like a very, very easy decision to raise the round just because he rejoins us. But yeah, that's like how we were thinking about it.
Great. That's all really fascinating. And I kind of want to double click into the serial entrepreneur point, because obviously you both have lessons learned and have takeaways regarding fundraising, but that's just one small part of actually creating a successful business. And so I'd kind of like to just pause and ask you both, is there anything you're doing differently in your current role as a leader of one of these ambitious companies that was either learned or you changed, compared to kind of who you were and how you acted at your previous businesses, among any dimension? Asking this because I know we have a bunch of founders that listen to the podcast, but even selfishly as a first time founder, I'm curious to hear what you've learned over the years. George, I'll kick it over to you first.
Sure. I think this time around, I'm much more focused on enjoying the process and the journey. We have such an amazing team. It's helpful that we're in a domain space that we all enjoy as consumers as well. So just really soaking that part in. I would say advice for others, especially whether you're a CEO or CTO, if you're just as a tech operator, it's really hard to do deep engineering work and multitask on many things simultaneously. So just really resist the urge to try to do everything yourself. It's crucial to let go and delegate. I think I got significantly better at that in my last company once we were acquired. But just taking some of those lessons and certainly learn, empower, acknowledge, and support your team as well.
Love it. Ilya?
Yeah, I generally just agree to like all these points. So I think partially we are like I'm behaving somewhat different from the previous startup, not by choice, but because it's easier to fundraise. There are some other things that are somewhat easier to do. Like even working with clients, having some track record before is somewhat more fun and easy and convenient. But I would say probably the biggest difference here is because we were more successful with fundraising and got more visibility. It's much easier to build a great team, and that's awesome. So I can just repeat what George said. I'm really enjoying the process much more, and I'm better in delegating things and trusting people, and hiring people that are much better than me in many aspects. That's awesome. Also, just industry-wise, right? So our previous company was building solutions for customer support, call centers, things like this. So the boring stuff. So this time, game and entertainment world is incredibly interesting. One indicator for me is when my kids hear who I am talking to in terms of clients, different game developers, right? So they are excited, and that's a great kind of example for them. So that's a separate motivation. But we work with world-class creators, writers, game designers. So that's really awesome. So in terms of advice, I think practically speaking, my main advice would be if you focus, especially if you're working on some deep tech solutions, if you focus on your product and technology and the value that it brings to the clients, right? So that's a big part of success. So even if it may take a little bit longer to be successful from business terms, you are kind of keep on creating this value and the experience with the team, and this is always very helpful. And so yeah, like focusing on that, I think is critical, especially like in the times where like it may be pretty challenging to raise VC money, or yeah, like where like some M&A market is somewhat like all frozen. Yeah.
All good advice, and I love to hear the parallels between you both as well. There's probably some wisdom in that then that a lot of us should be taking. I have kind of one last AI related question before we kind of close out, and I just kind of want to hear more about what's next for you and your companies. And my question is, obviously both your companies leverage AI for clients, but are you also unlocking or experimenting with AI adding value elsewhere in your business, whether it's like internal processes or whatever it might be? Just curious, since you're both on the bleeding edge of this.
Yeah, I can start. Well, we are obviously like using some AI tools internally, like Copilot, things like this, right? And just in building stuff. Well, same like our marketing people are using like image generators and like text generators and so on. So as like everybody now, I think we are also trying internally to be kind of like aware of like everything that's happening outside of AI NPCs. So I mean, like one of our developers recently who was on vacation, and he built like in his spare time like a point and click game basically that is like fully AI generated, right? So it's not just the characters, but like the landscape, the objects, the narrative, and so on, and that like really helps in understanding like where the industry is, like where there could be some like very interesting like findings, and where we could focus as well to achieve um, some interesting milestones.
Cool, George.
So I think you're asking about where we use AI out of like product, right? And
Yeah, just internally for processes and whatever it might be. Like we use ChatGPT for editing as a lame example, but maybe you have cooler examples.
yeah. I mean, I'm sure some people do that as well. Since we're starting to write things like blogs, our company was started 3 years ago at the beginning or towards the beginning of the pandemic. So we have a completely remote team. So that means that we have everybody updating things asynchronously. And I think that increases your communication costs and burdens. So I'm a big fan of just generally boosting operational efficiency and streamlining communication. So we definitely leverage our own internal tools that we built for other purposes and some vendor tools to help with this. Some basic things we do would be, in addition to editing, which I would guess like 80% of the people use in some way if they write, we automate recording of internal group meetings. We summarize action points from these meetings. We send follow-up nudges from these meetings. We also look more longitudinally and identify and surface recurring points of failure. So in addition to your standard retros, we're also getting some insight from this as well. I think some of it's probably because we just have a lot of, data focused people on the team that inherently like these things, and they're just trying to make their own lives easier. So naturally, we gravitate toward these tools.
Awesome. I guess to close, I just want to hear a bit more about what's next from your companies. Is there anything that we should be looking forward to? So I'll start this one with George with GGWP. What's next for the company? Is there anything that those of us from the outside should be looking forward to?
Yeah. So our two main focus areas are we need to continue onboarding and delivering value to large prospects and existing customers. And we really want to make our product more accessible, again, to help more small devs adopt, which means developing more self-serve features. Our long-term goal remains the same. It's fairly ambitious, even to become a holistic solution for gaming content moderation. And what that means is, you have different inputs like chat and player reports, which we have functioning products in. And then we have things in prototype form like voice and Discord, and exploration phase like images around experiences, avatars, and items and other things that we can help moderate as well. So we'll continue to add piece by piece in those different areas.
And if anyone wants to reach out to you specifically or GGWP in general, where should they go?
Yeah, any listeners can reach out to me directly via LinkedIn, just first name, last name, George Ng, or on X. I guess it feels awkward to say X instead of Twitter, but at Dr. George Ng. You can also visit our website at ggwp.com for more information.
Great. And Ilya, obviously you raised a lot of money. I know your team is in heavy building mode right now, but for those who are curious about the future of AI NPCs, what should we all be looking forward to next? What can you share with us?
So in the next 6 months, a year, we'll have more launches of these first integrations with major companies. Many of them are extensions and DLCs and mods because we are in this interesting market. I mean, I didn't realize it before we started the company that, for a AAA title, it may take 5-10 years to build it, right? And you have to be with them kind of on their year one when they decide on the tech stack. And so majority of things with new titles will be launched in 2-3 years when we will be 5 years old. In the meantime, we are focused on some kind of this, some of these experiences that are achievable and doable earlier. And as I mentioned before, as companies are turning more and more to using their and monetizing their existing IP, they are more interested in building these extensions and things like this. So that's a large focus for us because it obviously can demonstrate what's possible with AI NPCs, but also helps us to be ready, for scaling, to optimize, scaling, privacy, security, and everything that makes us more enterprise ready. And then obviously the main direction of development is just keeping building these the brains for NPCs. Here what is good about it is we are as I mentioned, we are trying to kind of approximate human actors, right? So we do not really need to create anything new. We just get closer and closer to the performance of real people, real actors that you may hire to be part of your experience. And so so basically product roadmap is really easy to build. You just look at the biggest gap between the character now and the human actor and start addressing it. There will be a lot of things there. So main focus is on multimodality. So in addition to speech, how we control characters to perform different actions within the environment, express themselves, we'll come up with new things and so on.
Great. And if people want to learn more or stay up to date over time, where can they find you or Inworld AI?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn is the best way. So feel free to contact me directly. And we've got a lot of ways to contact the company through Inworld AI website.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, guys, this has been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot from both of you today about, big picture where AI is going, how we can think through the details of, implementing it in our own industry and being smart about how we think about the future. And I'm bullish and excited about both of your companies and can't wait to see where they go into the future. So best of luck to both of you. Thank you for hopping on. And to all of our audience tuning in, thank you as well for listening to this episode. And we'll keep at it, and I'll see you next time. If you enjoyed today's episode, whether on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, or give a 5-star review. And if you want to reach out or provide feedback, shoot us a note at podcast@naavik.co or find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Plus, if you want to learn more about what Naavik has to offer, make sure to check out our website, www.naavik.co. There, you can sign up for the #1 games industry newsletter, Naavik Digest, or contact us to learn about our wide-ranging consulting and advisory services. Again, that is www.naavik.co. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.